Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose Remax.
Hello, my name is Andrew Faas, and welcome to Following the Golden Rule.
And I'm your co-host, Jay Remer, and for 26 weeks, Andy and I will be discussing the ABCs of building character. We very much appreciate all of the feedback that we've gotten, and it indicates that this series is being well received. This week, we're going to be talking about inclusion, which is a very big topic. It includes quite a lot of material. And it reminds me, Andy, of an article that you wrote about a year ago, prior to the federal election here, where you discussed the importance of focusing on the International Covenant of Rights, the lack of trust in leadership, and the necessity for people to really get engaged in their work and their lives in general. And that was a full year ago, and as I reviewed the article, it seemed to me that it could have been written yesterday. So I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Sure, and you're absolutely right. It could have been written yesterday because the conditions have really not changed relative to things like equity and inclusion and engagement. In fact, because of coronavirus, it has actually gotten worse. Because of coronavirus and the economic impact it's had and the need for organizations to restructure just to survive pretty much in every sector of our society and economy. It's what I worry about is that things like equity and inclusiveness and diversity are going to take a back seat, and the gap will widen.
I think that when you and I discussed the topic of inclusivity, one of the questions that I had was differentiating it between diversity, because I think that it's sort of a close cousin, and I wonder whether it would be helpful to make that distinction for the audience.
Yes, it's very important to make the distinction. Diversity and inclusion have really gone hand in hand in terms of a move well over 20 years ago to create more diverse and inclusive cultures. And to be sure, there's been a lot of focus on diversity and inclusion. And in America, it's an annual $8 billion spend. And that's just on diversity and inclusion. That excludes anti-harassment training and empathy training and all the other stuff that's put out by human resources. And it's had virtually no impact. And I would argue, based on research that I've done, in conjunction with Yale and with Mental Health America, that we've regressed in many of these in many of these areas. So again, it's basically rhetoric, and usually put in. These programs are put in as a public relations or legal shield. Versus genuinely putting something in place that will get cultures to be more diverse and inclusive. The thing that I think we need to understand And I don't think there should be a course on diversity and inclusion, because everybody who's worked for a large or mid-sized company has gone through the training. It's a very basic, simple differentiation. So diversity is actually very simple. It's just counting the heads and making sure that a unit is representative of the community in which they work and operate, and inclusion is making sure every head counts. So it's a very simple way of looking at it, but it becomes very difficult, not complex, but difficult to actually have it reflected in the cultures of the organizations.
Well, so given the given that sort of the privileged white men still run the country, so to speak, that would make sense, because they wouldn't want to be giving up anything that they have. But what steps can we take to make sure that inclusivity becomes a reality as opposed to just rhetoric?
Well, I think the best thing that people can do, and again, it's getting back to the individual, internalizing this, and individually and collectively forcing organizational leaders or leadership generally to take this seriously and go beyond the rhetoric and go beyond the human resource manuals and go beyond the whatever they put in place that hasn't worked. And that means basically to, one, don't just change the makeup of your board in response to a single movement, but look at all of the groups that have been excluded from the equation and make sure that your voices, as being a member of a minority group, to say enough's enough already. We need fundamental change to rebuild our economy and social system that's based on this premise.
Yeah.
And without even their voices being heard, let alone being part of the decision-making process, we're going to run into the same thing we ran into after the financial collapse a decade ago, over a decade ago, where it was to the benefit of the smaller, yes, white, male minority at the expense of everybody else.
So what can individuals do to make sure that they are included and that the systems shift to a more inclusive nature?
Well, this whole series is based on building leaders of character, and on the premise that everyone can become a leader. And by becoming a leader of character, you will gain some credibility relative to your influence and input, and collectively working with people who have like situations or perspectives, going to the people who will ultimately make the decisions, whether that be government or organizational leadership or leaders in the family unit, to to make those changes. But I think people, when they do this, and to understand being inclusive, I encourage people to look at it from the perspective of learning from situations where you have been excluded and how you felt about it. And then look at it from a perspective of when you, as an individual, excluded somebody from something that they should have participated in.
And so what are some of the reasons that do you think that people, I mean, you can even take a personal example if you wanted to, but you don't have to. But I think in general, what are some of the reasons that people are excluded? And how can we, because it's going to take a mind change in order to get us to think, oh, we need to change course here.
Well, I think it takes more than a mindset. And it takes being forced into making the changes. All of the programs and writing on diversity, equity, and inclusion and engagement are written from the perspective of trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced to change. And the biggest barrier to diversity and inclusion and engagement and equity are people who have the most to lose by doing that. Because the people in power today do not want to give up their power and control.
Right.
And in a command control system that most people work under, leadership just do not want to give up any of that. And there are other obvious reasons. Bias, implicit and otherwise. The other big one is and it falls in the power and control, but bosses generally, in particular bully bosses, and most of us have worked for a bully boss at some point in our life, have been most bully bosses will not include, i.e. hire or promote someone that is smarter than they are.
Oh.
And there's a real insecurity in people that says, well, if I hire this person, they may show me up. And I may not look as good or do as good. And again, that is a feeling of insecurity on their part, and a method by which they maintain that position of power and control.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting. The thing that comes to mind is the Peter Principle, where people are promoted to their level of incompetence. And it seems that we can notice that a lot in both government and the corporate world today. And if there was more inclusivity, it would perhaps it wouldn't be quite so obvious.
Right. So the thing I think that will and should resonate with everybody, and hopefully it'll be a motivation for people to take a serious look at this. Within 25 years, whites will be in the minority position.
Population-wise.
Population-wise.
Yes.
So I think what we have to think about is, are we going to be excluded or are our children or our grandchildren going to be excluded because we're no longer in the minority position? And the answer to that is, if those who are in the majority want to retaliate against years or centuries of being excluded, then the future does not look all that bright for whites. And from what I can determine, based on how people feel and why they feel the way they do, I believe that unless we respond to this whole area of diversity, equity, inclusion, and engagement in a genuine way, in a systemic way, or systematic way, where there's genuinely marks set for how we measure it and how we monitor it, then and we do it now, the outlook for whites in a minority position will be better.
Yeah. Do you think that there's any, I think, obviously, in the article that you wrote a year ago, it referred to, one of the things that we can do is we can change things at the ballot box. And I think that is obviously always going to be a factor. That's how democracy works. How do you think that the people in control right now do you think that there's any way that they will bend and remain in control without, I don't think there's anything we haven't seen anything to indicate that they will change unless they're removed. And I'm wondering if there's somewhere a happy medium someplace.
Well, until we get away from the polarization, far right or far left, and go somewhere in between. And that gets into the whole purpose of an organization. And the purpose of an organization is to provide for the benefit on an equitable basis for everyone. And it's talking about those basic rights that people have relative to a standard of living, an adequate wage, and stability and security. And another right that's not explicit is the right to be included. And particularly now, as organizations go through this rebuilding exercise, this rebuilding of our society, and have their voices heard, because what we're talking about is their destiny. And we have to look at innovative ways and out-of-the-box ways to address those inequities. And maybe it's getting back to an environment where we built communities, and we built communities by supporting local businesses and entrepreneurs. And I think we have to get back a bit more to that.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of jobs lost. Younger people are going to have to reinvent themselves from saying, okay, working in the corporate world is I'm no longer a fit there. And maybe I can try something that will be better relative to my future.
Yeah.
But it is dependent on people supporting those smaller businesses and entrepreneurs.
There has to be a desire to change, and that is most likely going to happen on the individual basis, I would think. Individuals will likely change more easily than large corporations. And I think it takes us to the sort of one of the themes of this series about about the golden rule, and how do we want to be treated when we find ourselves on the flip side of the coin. And perhaps those of us who have a real interest in seeing this transformation can take the initiative and really take the bull by the horns and look at this in an honest, open way, and with the desire to reform things. And those of us who are interested in doing that are going to be, able to move forward with the movement, and those of us who aren't are going to be hopefully sidelined.
Well, I would turn that around a little bit. Yes, as with all of our characteristics, it does start with the individual. But in terms of desire, people want to change. Generally, the majority of people want this change. They want more diversity. They want more equity. They want more to be more engaged, and they want to be included in it. Mm-hmm. And I've gone well beyond trying to convince the 10% or 1%ers that it makes good business sense mm-hmm. to change it. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to change.
Yeah.
They want to hang on to what they have, and they don't want to share the pie any more than they do today. The fact that today we're still fighting a $15 minimum wage mm-hmm. Says that there's no desire on their part. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say this has to be forced on them.
Yeah.
They should have no choice.
Yeah.
If you're going to operate in this environment, you need to be diverse, you need to be inclusive, you need to be equitable, and you need your people engaged.
Right.
And this is not calling on CEOs, but it's calling on governments and boards of directors of the institutions to follow whether it's a regulation or edict or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to play in this arena, you have to play by these ground rules
right.
and principles.
Right.
So scrap all of the HR training programs because they've done nothing. Mm-hmm. Figure out how you're going to operate with these principles.
Right.
And it'll be at your peril if you don't.
Yeah.
And this is something I forecasted 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're trying to change a system while the cultural bombs I referred to are going off. Mm-hmm. In the U.S., there's already a civil war mm-hmm. going on.
Yes.
And hopefully there will be an election where people can cast their ballot for a change.
Yes.
But I think we've gone far beyond that, where people need to be very explicit, mm-hmm. saying, these are my rights.
Yes.
And one of the rights include being included in fixing what you broke.
That's right. So it really does boil down to, as you were saying earlier, and we've mentioned a number of times in the series, the importance of the individual becoming a leader. And the leader the way we can be leaders is by forcing those in power to do what we want. And if they don't, then they get booted out, or people won't invest in their companies. I mean, those are the two choices, right?
Those are the choices, and it talks a little bit about the interdependencies of the characteristics we're talking about. Last week we talked about expecting leaders to be honest versus hoping that leaders are honest. And it's not a matter of hoping that we're going to get inclusion. It's a matter of expecting that we're going to get exclusion. Or
demanding.
Well, and that's part of the equation. And if leadership can't provide that, then it's kind of a philosophy I've followed all of my life. Two leaders that I've been responsible for is you either change or you're going to be changed.
Right.
Simple as that.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting to see the dynamic required to make this transformation, and to see the connections between the word this week, which was inclusion, with the other words that we have discussed so far and the ones that will be coming forward, and to remind people of the importance of really thinking about what these words mean to them, and how do they see themselves? Are they inclusive in their decision-making processes, and are they included in processes that they're a part of? And to weigh those characteristics in their lives on a regular basis, along with the other characteristics that we've discussed.
Just to reiterate the point you just made, and last week we asked people to name 5 people that they have absolute trust in. And like your reaction, over the last week I got a lot of reaction from people on how tough that was. And I knew that beforehand, because for me it was very tough to do that. In this instance, learn from what you have experienced in being excluded from something you should have been part of. And then also be intellectually honest. This is where again the honesty characteristic come in. Be intellectually honest when you assess where you've excluded people for one reason or the other.
Yeah. So thank you, Andy, for your thoughts on inclusion today. They're very helpful and insightful. And thank you for watching the show today. And we look forward to seeing you next week when we discuss J is for Just.
Following the Golden Rule with Andrew Faas is proudly supported by Remax St. Andrews. Live and vacation by the sea. Choose wisely. Choose Remax.